Welcome back. We're getting right to some talking points. In our next panel, I want to start with Michael Bloomberg's looming presidential or potential presidential bid. Here to break it all down are Heath Brown, an associate professor of public policy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and CBSN New York's urban affairs expert, Mark Peters. Thank you guys for being here. So let's get right to it. Michael Bloomberg for president. Can he do it?
Well, I think you should never count out somebody who's managed to be elected mayor 3 times and who has the kind of financial resources that he does. But I also think that in many ways he's facing an uphill climb. He's obviously going to pass on the early primary states, and historically that's been very hard for people to do. And there is some real baggage, both stop and frisk, which I know we'll talk about later. But even beyond stop and frisk, there are a bunch of other things that he did as mayor that are going to annoy the liberal wing of the Democratic Party.
Let's talk. What do you think? Does Michael Bloomberg have a chance? I mean, he's already spent $100 million on digital ads, $20 million on a get out the vote campaign in battleground states where Trump did well, but that the Democrats normally had traditionally won, like Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina. What do you think?
You know, he's going to run, but in 2020, it's hard for me to imagine that money's really going to make a difference here in these primaries. I don't think this is the election where the candidate who spends the most is going to win. I think this is a race where the narrative is going to make the most difference.
But is it the narrative of money that's going to be the thing, or is it going to be the narrative of I'm a moderate and that's the only way that you can defeat Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think that's likely to be his narrative, and I think the things that he has cared a lot about and spent a lot of his own money on the last couple of years, gun violence being one of the most prominent ones, I think are going to be part of the way he pitches himself. But it just doesn't seem to me that there's going to be a clear narrative that he has that can distinguish himself from the large number of candidates that are already in the race. So I think he's going to run, but the chance of him getting to the top seems pretty small right now.
You don't think he has a path?
I don't see a path. I don't see a path right now between whom. It seems like maybe running to the right of Joe Biden. Joe Biden right now is in such a strong position, it seems like there isn't a whole lot of room that you can go to the right of him right now.
But what about this? What about the fact that you've heard the name Biden during the impeachment hearings? Does that have a lasting effect going forward on reducing his popularity? You
know, we're living in such polarized times that the repetition again and again and again, I think for Democrats is nothing but a positive thing. I think it reinforces the belief that this is their person who's being attacked.
Right. Well, I think to Heath's point, we now have some post, impeachment hearings polling, and certainly some post, since this whole thing has been rolled out polling, and it doesn't seem as though any of this has hurt Joe Biden's polling numbers. So obviously there's a long way to go. Obviously a lot is going to happen between now and Iowa, let alone now and Super Tuesday. But at least the initial polling that we have suggests that it hasn't been hurting Joe Biden, which, to your point, means it's a very, very narrow path. I wouldn't say there's no path for Michael Bloomberg, but I would say it's a very narrow path that requires a bunch of different things to fall into place, only some of which the amount of money that he's got can help him achieve.
Well, let's switch to Michael Bloomberg's reversal on stop and frisk. When I talked to the Reverend Al Sharpton, he said one speech is not going to do it in terms of an apology. What do you think, Heath?
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of my students who come to me the last day of the semester and ask for extra credit. The time to ask for this is earlier in the semester, and there have been years that have gone by when Michael Bloomberg could have offered this same apology when there's maybe a little less at stake. So I think it's a little too late. I think people have been waiting for this for a long time, and I think most are ready to move on. I think it's 3, 4, 5 years too late to hear from the
But what about the
former
fact
mayor.
that during his last term, stops and frisks actually were reduced by 90%, and it's a tactic that the NYPD still uses. In fact, last year, the NYPD made 11,000 stop and frisk stops. So, is it completely going to stop him from being president, or are people going to look at this whole record?
Well, I think 2 things. One is, it's true that stop and frisk went down in the last year of his term, but that was only after a federal court intervened and found the practice discriminatory. 11,000 stops sounds large until you realize that at the height of stop and frisk, we were up to 685,000 stops. So going down to 11,000 is a small number. Everybody in law enforcement, and I've been in law enforcement, everyone in law enforcement agrees that there are instances where stop and frisk, as enunciated by the Supreme Court in Terry, is a valuable law enforcement tool in certain instances where a properly trained police officer sees something that gives them real concern that somebody may be, somebody may have a dangerous weapon.
See, in the context of the presidential campaign, is it fair to evaluate Michael Bloomberg merely on stop and frisk when he has a record that also has some very positive things? Everything from obtaining mayoral control of the schools, smoking ban, climate change, Plan NYC. He was the first to do bike lanes, and he started City Bike. The Times Square and Herald Square redevelopment, extending the 7 line. He was the first to propose congestion pricing. He extended the 2nd Avenue subway and got the money. Green taxis for the outer boroughs. He does have a record of accomplishment that could also sell him in a lot of these Super Tuesday states, or do you disagree with that?
I mean, he certainly has a record of accomplishment. I think 2 things. One is stop and frisk was a truly terrible policy that is still, stop and frisk as practiced by Mike Bloomberg, was a truly terrible policy that
and Ray Kelly.
And Ray Kelly. But Ray Kelly was Mike Bloomberg's police commissioner. Ray Kelly, ultimately Michael Bloomberg is responsible for what Ray Kelly does. But stop and frisk as practiced by Mike Bloomberg was a terrible policy that we are still trying to heal the wounds from 6 years later. So it's a big
the
negative
present
in the
police
ledger.
commissioner, James O'Neill, says it's a policy that has a place in policing in New York City.
Sure, but at 11,000 stops, not 685,000 stops. I'm sorry.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That I think this is a question of scale, and the scale issue is, I think, what was the most problematic of that time period. And these statistics, I think, point to that. But when we look at these accomplishments, this is the same problem that every mayor has ever faced when they run for the presidency. Once you get outside of New York City, bike lanes, stop and frisk, all of these different accomplishments
Smoking ban?
in the city.
He was the first.
It's wonderful. I just have trouble believing that voters across the country are going to be looking to those city accomplishments in the same way.
He was the man who started climate change, Plan NYC, sustainability. That's like one of the top issues in the country today.
I think if Michael Bloomberg takes credit for stopping climate change, he's going to get the same exact reaction that Al Gore got to when he claimed to start the internet. I think that kind of credit taking works at the local level, but when you go national, I think it's going to be a much harder sell that these kind of things are going to resonate with voters.
So let's talk about Corey Johnson, Speaker Johnson, and his plan to redesign city streets, more bus lanes, more bike lanes, less space for cars. How do you feel about it?
Well, I think as a policy matter, there's certainly a lot to be said for more bike lanes, more bus lanes, trying to get us less dependent on cars. As a political matter, I think that's a different story. I mean, right now there are 1.9 million cars registered to New Yorkers. That's a lot of people who may not hear attack on the car culture in the way that the Speaker wants them to hear it.
Heath?
You know, I've heard this characterized as revolutionary. I think maybe that's even the way the Speaker referred to this plan. This is not a revolutionary plan. If you're looking to revolutionize in the area of bike lanes, there are all sorts of things that you could do that greatly change it. This is a 6-month plan. I can't imagine what people are going to do with these bike lanes during the winter. So there are revolutionary things you can do. In the Netherlands, they have heated bike lanes. If you want to really revolutionize the way people get to and from work, let's do things like that. I think that's really...
A heated bike lane?
A heated bike lane. No ice, no snow. You can drive in the middle of the winter to and from work on a heated bike lane. That's really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about some minor changes that are probably not actually going to happen in the long run. So I think this is a pretty moderate proposal when it comes down to it, especially when you take into account the politics of this and when you're going to actually have to pay for this plan. It's unlikely to be quite as ambitious.
I think that you just gave the bike lobby a new thing to lobby Mayor de Blasio for, heated bike lanes.
If they can do it in Amsterdam, they could do it in New York City.
I don't know. So what about the fact that it was clear that Corey Johnson wants to run for mayor and is going to run on an anti-Bill de Blasio platform? Is that how? What was your take on that?
That's what I read as well. You know, I heard him, and I didn't know if this was an official announcement, but it sure sounded like it. Is this the first day of his campaign? Maybe.
This was certainly the closest I've heard him come to saying, "I'm running for mayor. I'm announcing my campaign." I mean, this was. He was more aggressive about I'm clearly running and running as not Bill de Blasio today than I've ever heard him before in the last several months leading up to this.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Coming up, commuters get their chance to sound off on their biggest transit woes. Stay with us.